We have so many stories in our lives, but our stories are not always heard. On the Hear My True Story podcast, we tell our own true stories.
Before the white car parked, our head teacher had scattered. Looking at him, I could only see his tie that was flying backwards, waving at us, and he disappeared in thin air.
I want to share my life story. I want to share my voice with the people because I know that just a small joke I can tell through this podcast, it will make someone smile.
When you ask me what I fear most in life, I would definitely respond to you and say it's fear itself.
We are fighting for togetherness. We are fighting for equal rights. We are fighting to end injustice.
You don't have to be a storyteller or writer because, guess what? Life writes the best stories.
Hear my true story.
You see, in 2020, that was my second Christmas celebrations in Germany. By that time, I was facing culture shocks. I was in this kind of culture confusion. And then my wife gave me a Christmas gift. And guess what? It was Makumbi's book, Manchester Happened. It felt like she handed me a manual for surviving Europe as a Ugandan. In 2 days, I was done with reading this book. I was laughing, smiling, and feeling sad at the same time when I was enjoying these wonderful stories written by a wonderful African writer, a Ugandan. In today's episode, with Ugandan Art Speaks Out, we are bringing you a conversation with Jennife Nansubuga Makumbi in Uganda. Trust me, you guys, after listening to this episode, you will get to understand why she is the rock star of Ugandan authors.
This is your favorite time of the week with your number one podcast.
Hear my true story.
Welcome to Hear My True Story podcast. I'm your host, Otako. Today, I am going to tell you my journey as a migrant, where my homesickness for Uganda took me into an adventure. You know, living as a minority in a foreign land comes with challenges, but guess what came to my rescue? Literature. My friends, especially literature of African writers. And yes, I'm talking about writers from Uganda. You know, to give you a small background, back in Uganda, I was all about global literature, giving our local authors the side eye. But then, I landed in Germany, and suddenly, Ugandan literature became my superhero. It moved me closer to my roots. You see, in 2020, that was my second Christmas celebrations in Germany. By that time, I was facing culture shocks. I was in this kind of culture confusion. And then my wife gave me a Christmas gift. And guess what? It was Makumbi's book, Manchester Happened. It felt like she handed me a manual for surviving Europe as a Ugandan. In 2 days, I was done with reading this book. I was laughing, smiling, and feeling sad at the same time when I was enjoying these wonderful stories written by a wonderful African writer, a Ugandan. This is the moment when I felt like, wow, I am a proud Ugandan because I saw books written by other writers. I could enjoy them. But this was a special book that was written by an African writer who is a Ugandan. Everything that was happening in the book, I felt so close to it. I felt so touched everything. My dear listeners, this is the moment when I felt like, wow, what literature can do for anyone who's living abroad. It is that special feeling of feeling home, that special feeling of feeling like there is someone who is telling a story that you relate with. This is what made me fall in love with Jennifer Makumbi's works. So, my dear listeners, dive into Makumbi Jennifer's Nansubuga collections, from Chintu to the latest book of A Girl is a Body of Water. Those are wonderful literature written by Ugandan author. Now, here is the interesting part of my story. I loved Makumbi's work so much that I begged the team at Ugandan Art Speaks Out podcast to let me share part of a conversation that she had in Uganda right here on Hear My True Story podcast. Just so you know, Ugandan Art Speaks Out is a brainchild of Omuti Kreativ, an organization shaking things up with art for social change and empowerment in Uganda. And guess what? Myself, Otako, the host of the podcast, I am one of the masterminds behind this organization. And what is so interesting is that as the year is wrapping up, we are also organizing a crowdfunding campaign for the organization Omuti Kreativ in Uganda. So you are invited, my dear listeners, if you want to support the work of Omuti Kreativ in Uganda, listen to the podcast, but also go to the description of this episode. You'll find a link where you can support the works of Omuti Kreativ through the crowdfunding. Now, to not waste your time, my dear listeners, get ready, because in today's episode with Ugandan Art Speaks Out, we are bringing you a conversation with Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi in Uganda. Trust me, you guys, after listening to this episode, you will get to understand why she is the rock star of Ugandan authors. So, my dear listeners, well, I hope you enjoyed this special episode with our collaboration with Ugandan Art Speaks Out podcast as we bring you Ugandan literature. Well, thank you for listening to Hear My True Story podcast. I hope you enjoyed the episode.
This week's special guest on your favorite podcast.
Hear My True Story.
Welcome to Ugandan Art Speaks Out, a podcast where creativity flows and the art of storytelling thrives. Join us today as we delve into the enchanting world of Jennifer Makumbi and her craft. In this workshop, we'll unravel the secrets behind her written word, exploring the mind of the accomplished author, her inspirations, and the techniques that breathe life into her characters and world. Whether you're a budding writer, seeking inspiration, or a seasoned wordsmith looking to enhance your skills, this podcast promises to be a captivating journey through the minds of literary artisans. So grab your favorite notebook and a pen, and let's embark on the literary adventure together.
Okay, I'll begin by introducing Jennifer Makumbi, although she needs no introduction. Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi is a Ugandan fiction writer. Her first novel, Chintu, won the Kwani Manuscript Project in 2013. Her second book is a collection of short stories published in spring 2019 in the UK and the Commonwealth as Manchester happened. It was shortlisted for the Big Book Prize Harper's Bazaar. Her third book, which came out in autumn 2020, is The First Woman, Rachel's personal favorite, and was published in the US as A Girl is a Body of Water. Her books have been translated into 5 languages, including German, Dutch, Italian, French, and Turkish. Jennifer is a recipient of the Wyndham Campbell Literature Prize in 2018. She won the Global Commonwealth Short Story Prize in 2014 for her short story, Let's Tell the Story Properly. She's a Choose International Writing Fellow, which she was awarded in 2019, and a No Nice residency, which she undertook in 2021. She has a PhD from Lancaster University and has been a senior lecturer at several universities in Britain. Most recently, she undertook a fellowship in Berlin with the Deutsche Akademische Austauschdienst, on which she was working on her next novel, I've been told, so all very excited for that. This is going to be a very organic conversation. So I'll begin with the issue of even finding an agent and a publisher. I feel like the process of becoming published as a writer, it's very nebulous and unclear. There's many gates and gatekeepers to navigate, and sometimes I feel that this is unclear on purpose, doubly so for African writers from the continent who don't have access to those networks. So as an African writer trying to break through the international publishing world, how do you even go about finding a literary agent and a publisher?
Okay. Hello? Yeah, sorry. Hi, everyone. Thank you for turning up. You've abandoned the kids who are doing S4 and decided to come here. But I'm really, really glad to see all of you here. First of all, it's a reminder that I have a market here, that I won't go hungry if I write another book. But also there's this idea that Africans don't read, even though Africans are writing. And it's until you come back and people turn up and they remind you and they are eager to hear and to read. And you just go back to your computer thinking, goodness me, I can do this. So much as I'm inspiring to writers, readers turning up in numbers like this are so inspiring to me as well. So thank you very much. So how do you go on about breaking into international writing?
Absolutely. How do you go about finding an agent and a publisher as an African writer?
That is an African writer on the continent?
Yes.
Okay. Besides writing a fantastic book?
Yes, just that minor thing. That's easy enough to do.
Because that is quite easy. First of all, I think we need to look at the idea of international publishing, because normally it should be that when you get published in your home country, in this case, which is Uganda. So if you get published in Kenya, in West Africa, in South Africa, then you're internationally published. But as you can see the faces, nobody is convinced that that is international publishing, because we all believe that being published in the West, first and foremost, is being internationally published. And I am not going to find fault with that, because I did think like that as well. And indeed, so for example, when I went to Germany to do this fellowship, I was asked, have you been internationally published? And I don't think writing to them and saying, oh, Chinto came out in Kenya first, and sending them a review in the East African would have cut it. So they do like to see you have been reviewed in the Guardian, in the Washington Post, somewhere in Holland, you know. So it is, I agree, it is important to be published in the West, because the West only knows the West. So how do you go about finding an agent in the West while you're on the continent? Now, I am not going to lie to you, that is difficult, because agents themselves want to promote you when you're closer. The major problem is that when you publish, the first thing the publisher wants to know is, will you be available to promote your book? And if they're going to fly you from Africa, because for them, the market is where?
The West.
In the West. So they are going to market you in the West. So if you send a book, a wonderful book, perfect, fantastic book from Uganda to an agent in London, and the agent is gushing all over it, you had better sell in millions, because then they need the money to fly you to Britain, put you in a hotel, which is all expensive, feed you, and then transport you around Britain to promote it before they fly you to the US and other people who've published here. So that is one of the major problems that probably agents are reluctant to take on someone from Africa. But hey, if the agent is excited about the book and they say this is going to sell in millions, or that they will fly you over and put you in an expensive hotel and wine and dine here, depending on how much you're going to sell. Now, having said that, Achebe wrote in Africa. Things Fall Apart traveled from Nigeria to England. It was even typed because he wrote in hand. So it was typed there, and he used the typed form to get an agent, and it traveled Europe without him being there. The same as the palm wine drinkard. Yeah, he never even traveled to Europe, ever. And yet his book traveled. So much as I've told you about the agents, you never know. You could be the one person who write that book and change the publishing industry. And the other thing is because recently Europe, especially Britain, is becoming aware of African readerships. Nigeria is fantastic. I mean, those people buy books. So, and Ugandans buy my books. I can only speak for myself. And so because of that, my publisher has changed. So whenever a book of mine is coming out, my publisher asks me, would you like to go and launch it in Uganda first? But that is because you guys have been buying my books, you know? And I understand Goretti is now in publishers, because of what is happening to me. Publishers are seeking her out. Penguin, hi, Goretti. We have other African writers you could sell, So if we keep up this, I mean, of course, I'm flogging my books, but if we all keep on buying books, we can change the publishing world from over there. Okay? It's all about the money. Honestly, it's just about the money. The way I'm treated is so different because of the way you treat my books. Okay? So if you get behind an author, and the publishers realize, okay, we are sending so many books in Uganda, they will publish you while you're in Uganda, and they will promote your book in Uganda, and then afterwards promote you in Europe. That's my belief.
Make sure to leave a review. This makes our day and fuels future episodes. Hear my true story.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. Okay, you all heard her. Keep buying her books, because that means her next book, we can launch it here in Uganda. I wanted to pick up on something you said earlier about the West only knowing the West.
Yeah.
And I think that's really interesting, because I read an interview with you in which you said that Chintu was initially rejected for being, quote unquote, too African, and that British publishers and readers, they like to have something they can relate to in books, be it Western characters or familiar settings and storylines, if they're reading books about Africa. But you said that Chintu is proper Africa. Yeah. So that would lead me to my next question. What type of stories by African writers attract international publishers, also international?
Okay. Thank you. Can you hang on to that question? Because I've just realized that perhaps people want to know how to get an agent.
Yes, that is true.
So often we say, pick up go to the internet, look up the agencies you're interested in Britain or in the US. Okay? Now, look at the authors they've published. Look at the kind of African authors they've published. And look at the books they've published. Look at the covers. All these tiny little things matter. Look at the covers, the way they look, because all of the agent fights for you on this. And then write an email. Now, that's where it starts to get difficult because they receive a lot of emails. So I did that when I first started, and it wasn't helpful very much. However, one of the things that I found interesting is if you've written a real good book, make sure you have what we call a presence online. So when you send your letter, put in, and I've written this book, and I've been published in this magazine. I was shortlisted for the short story. I have taken part in this. So they look at that you have a footprint online, because the problem is promoting you. Publishers don't want to start from zero. They want to see that you've been around, that you're familiar, people know something about you. So often that helps. The other thing that I found that helps, which I don't do, is your Twitter, social media. People who have 30,000 followers. Yes, because they count 1 plus 30,000 and they've sold 20,000 books, So that also helps. But as you're writing your long novel, write short stories, publish them, write short stories, send them out to all kinds of short story competitions. It all adds up, okay? So if an agent receives 100 letters a day, and you have all of that, you stand a chance. If you don't, you're going to find it such a high mountain to climb. The other thing I would advise you to do is attend these functions. Okay? If there's a festival, go and listen to the authors who've been there. And then, and I'm not saying that you do this with me, but do this with other authors. Cozy up to them. Hi. Oh, I'm Ugandan. I am Jennife. I've read all your books. And Chintu is my favorite. It changed my life. And then say, I've just finished writing a book, and it's about this and that, and I have been published here and I've published there, and I'm looking for an agent. Now, if you find them in a good mood, they might say, okay, send me your first 3 chapters and I'll read them. Whatever you do, don't send the whole novel, because that's it. It will block you and will not write back to you. Send the first 3 chapters. If that author is happy with the first 3 chapters, they could talk to their agent. My agent will read somebody I have suggested sooner than all the fantastic emails that have been sent to her. And that's how most of us got agents. We just turned up every time. You got an author, you say, hello. My name is Jennifer. I do that, and that. I say, okay, send me your first 3 chapters. And then, somehow they introduce you to an agent. They read your work. They easily take you up from that, rather than, they call it a slush, the submission, because it's too much. So I needed to say that.
No, thank you. This is incredibly useful. Thank you so much. So I think I'd like to go back to my other question. So what type of stories by African writers attract international publishers in the first place?
Okay. I know there are trends in publishing. Okay. For a long time in the past, the kind of stories they loved in the West. They were the kind of stories that affirmed what they knew about Africa. So, of course, if you wrote about the war, if you wrote about poverty, indeed, HIV, AIDS, those stories sold. But of course, then people like us have gone around and made a lot of noise about that, how that is so cliched and doesn't represent Africa at all. Now, personally, I would advise you not to follow a trend. Do not write a novel because, somebody wrote a novel about, let's say what, and it sold 1 million. And then you are going to do that. You know how the market works here. Someone brings tomatoes here, and tomorrow someone has tomatoes there, and another, and you think, seriously, why don't you diversify? But it happens in publishing as well. So remember J.K. Rowling's? Yes. Yeah. That was the time that I went into lecturing. You have no idea how many students in creative writing courses were turning up with stories about witches. And then there was Stephanie
Meyer.
Uh-huh. And we had a lot of romance between vampires, So don't write a story just because you think it will sell. Besides, readers, as you know, will see right through you. Anyway, so write a story that comes straight out of you. A story that you can't suppress, okay? That you feel this needs to be written, even if it has never been written, which is almost impossible. So, and for me, I tend to want to be unique, okay? And even if I'm going to write a feminist novel, I'm going to ask myself, what hasn't been written? So which means you have to be a reader, a fantastic, good reader, and you read a lot. So you know what is coming out, so you can give us a new take on a familiar subject. So I would not advise you to write a specific story, but write a story that is so true to you and to your audience, and know your audience. For me, my audience is Ugandan. I write in Britain, but my audience is Ugandan, and the British have accepted that. And the world has accepted that they are going to be outsiders to my writing, that I always put Ugandans first. And they've accepted that. Readers, because all readers are just like you. How many books have you read that are not Ugandan? More, probably 99% of all your reading is non-Ugandan. So if you are reading other people, why do you write for other people? So I would not say that this is the kind of story that sells in the West. That is, if you want to be published in the West. Write a story true to you. However, write well. And this is the problem I've seen, because I mentor script. I read people's scripts. So, for example, often when I am in Britain, anybody who's Ugandan or East African and is finishing a PhD in creative writing is going to ask their university, can I have Makumbi to
supervise?
Not supervise the exam, the Viva.
Okay, to be the external examiner.
Yeah. So, and normally when I come across scripts that are Ugandan, I would say, okay, well done, you're passed. But now I'm going to spend a year with you trying to work on this manuscript. And what I've found is that we have fantastic stories. I mean, people say that when you walk on the streets in Africa, every person you pass is a unique story that has never been told. It is true. So most of the people whose stories I've read are just blowing, you know, but it's the skill. The skill is letting us down, you know, because writing has two elements to it. The imagination and creativity, and, you know, that's where the story comes from and the characters you create. Wonderful. But then how you put that on paper is the major problem. So make sure your story is well written. And that is because now in publishing, the editor is vanishing. Okay? This is where the creative writing courses come in. When you go to the creative writing course, you learn to edit your work. Okay? So you will send a fantastic book to Britain, and they'll look at it and they'll need something like £15,000 to edit it because it's that poorly written. Even if it's good, they'll say no. Okay? I am good at writing. You know, I was an English teacher here. All my study has been in English, language, and literature. But once I finish my novel, I pay money to an editor to edit my writing before I send it to a publisher. Now, if I do this, think about your writing. Didn't you expect me to tell you the truth? Yeah, I am telling you, one of the things that is wrong with our writing, we are so wordy. Yeah, as Ugandans, we go that way, and we go that way, and then we go that way, and then we go back. We are going that way, but the story goes that way, and a little bit, they need to know this, and they need to know that. No, go that way, you know? So the structure, the language, everything must be perfect. If the publisher looks at it and knows I'm not going to spend a lot of money on this, they'll take it up.
Dear listeners, today we've had an incredible discussion. But hold on tight because the excitement does not end here. In our next episode, we'll be delving deeper into the crafting and honing of your writing skills. Get ready to uncover fascinating insights, explore expert opinions from Jennife Makumbi, and gain a new perspective. Trust me, you won't want to miss it. So mark your calendars and make sure to tune in for our upcoming episode. It's going to be an enlightening journey you won't want to miss.
Enjoying this episode? Leave a review now.
Hear my true story.
Oh, well, my dear listener, thank you for listening to Hear My True Story podcast. That was the special episode that was brought to you by Ugandan Art Speaks Out podcast with Hear My True Story podcast. This is a special collaboration where we find ourselves sharing stories from all people from all over around the world. What else other than collaborating and bringing wonderful stories? Well, for the listeners who got a chance to enjoy this podcast, this particular episode, you are welcome to support their authors, the African writers, buy their books. If you want to dive into African books written by African writers, by African publishers, well, go in there, find these books, support the wonderful stories. Yeah, this episode is not sponsored at any point. It's just from the love of the host, myself, who fell in love with one of the books that was written by Jennife Nansubuga Makumbi. That book is entitled Manchester Happened. It really resonated with my experience since I moved to Germany as a migrant. And now I got a chance to share the conversation of the author on this wonderful podcast, Hear My True Story. For those who are listening for the first time, this is Hear My True Story podcast. You can find us on all podcast streaming platforms. And for those who have just joined us today and they found that, well, there is also a wonderful podcast called Ugandan Art Speaks Out, where you can get to know more about Ugandan culture, the diversity, and all stories from all Ugandan writers, artists, publishers. Well, listen to Ugandan Art Speaks Out on all podcast streaming platforms. And for my dear listeners, if you want support Hear My True Story podcast, go to hearmytruestory.com, where you can support us and have us tell more stories. And for the listeners who would like to support Omuti Kreativ, please go to the description of this podcast. You'll find a link that will take you direct to where we are running our crowdfunding. Any support that you offer to this organization really supports the change of people and also supports the communities of Reza in Wakiso, Uganda. Well, my dear listeners, for those who are supporting me as a storyteller, but at the same time a podcaster, you can reach me on my email here at hearmytruestory.com, and you can tell your own story if you want to share a story. If you want to be hosted on this wonderful podcast, you write us an email. Also, if you're interested in our stories, well, give us a shout out. Say, guys, that is a wonderful episode. Well, then we are happy. Then we can also be positive in sharing more stories. What makes us so happy is when we hear from our listeners, when they give us feedback. That is what makes us so happy. Thank you for supporting Hear My True Story podcast. It has been me, Otako, your host. Till next week on the same podcast, we shall continue with the same conversation with Jennife Nansubuga Makumbi as she tells her story. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for listening to our podcast, Music by Edwin Matovo, hosted and produced by Otako. Subscribe to our podcast for more stories and visit us on our website, hearmytruestory.com, for more stories. All the links are listed in the show notes of this podcast.